Welcome. I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. Thank you for joining us for another round of open government lessons. During this class, you'll learn how to work outside the public records law in Vermont to get the documents you need. Maybe you made a public records request and were denied. You appealed the denial and again were told that the records you need are off limits. Meanwhile, your deadline is looming and a story needs to be told. What can you do when the state's public records law doesn't work in your favor and you find yourself out of options? We'll soon hear how reporter Liam Elder Connors answered that question. If you haven't already, please view our previous classes on public records, open meetings, and state court systems. The lessons we provide are all cumulative, starting you off with the basics and then gradually addressing more nuanced areas of law and journalism practice. The classes are state-specific and provide practical, step-by-step lessons you won't find anywhere else. You can find them all in our FOI guide at nfac.org/FOI guide and on our YouTube channel, 5 Freedoms. Before we begin, I want to recognize the estate of Gloria L. Negri for its support of these classes. Gloria was a trailblazing journalist at the Boston Globe for more than 50 years. This program is part of her legacy of newsroom education and her lifelong commitment to local journalism. You can learn more about Gloria and other NEFAC supporters at nfac.org/supporters. During today's presentation, I encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat and share your own experiences and resources. You can also use the chat or the Q&A button to ask questions of our instructor, and we'll get to as many of those questions as possible. Liam, all yours.
Thanks, Justin. I think I'm just going to get the presentation going. But I think this is a great lesson, and I'm glad to be thinking about how to get to records sort of outside of just using the law, which in Vermont, there are tons of exemptions and ways that you end up getting redacted records. And sometimes it's easier to go around the law or think about what are other creative ways to get the records. And sometimes that works out a lot better than making the formal request. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about ways I think about records and go about getting them, and maybe not just in the normal way of sending the letter that I'm sure everyone has their own kind of template of that. So I'm not going to be talking too much about formal requests since we've covered that in previous classes. So the first thing, this isn't a new, this is not my idea. This is an idea that I've heard before, but just something to keep in mind of like maintaining a records state of mind when it comes to your work. My beat here at Vermont Public is criminal justice and public safety. I also cover, poverty and also issues related to housing at times. And so one thing that is important for me is I spend a lot of time thinking about what are the records related to things that often come up. For me, that's usually court records, that's criminal cases, civil cases, Brady letters, which are those letters that can be filed by prosecutors if they have a credibility issue with a police officer. I think about all of these things that frequently come up, and I try to anticipate when I might need those records before I need them. It's kind of a tough way maybe of approaching it, but I try to proactively get records before I'm on deadline, so I'm not in that crunch that Justin was talking about where it's like, oh no, I'm suddenly on deadline. I need to have this story done in an hour and I really need these records. So I'm trying to get ahead of that a little bit. And so some questions to ask yourself are, what are the records that you commonly need on your beat? Maybe you cover housing and public safety. And so if your municipality that you cover primarily does annual inspections of housing, of apartment buildings, do you know how to get those records? So if there's, let's say, a fire at one of those buildings, do you have the records to make sure that those buildings have been in compliance for a long time, or maybe they're not in compliance and you have that paper trail. So thinking ahead to what kind of stories might break on your beat and what records might allow you to tell maybe not the breaking story, but the second and third day story that advances it beyond just the simple that this happened. So that's sort of the last point there. Like, what is the second or third day story? As reporters, we're often kind of juggling multiple kinds of stories at once. The daily story of this thing is happening right now, the second or third day story, which is more context and analysis for the story, and then these longer enterprise and investigative stories as well, which could take weeks or months. But I think really one thing I've learned in the decade or so that I've been doing journalism is that having a good sense of the records that you need on your beat to tell those second and third day stories and how to get them quickly means you're going to be faster. If you have competitors in other newsrooms that you're trying to get ahead of, this can sort of help with that too. But you'll just tell stronger stories. So some of the questions, right? What do you need? Who controls access to those records? Is it one specific person? Is it a clerk? Is there a database online that you can get to and download those things easily? Thinking about that and knowing how to get those records is important. So spend a little bit of time, if you've got a day that's quiet, just sort of going through and making some plans like this so that when the news breaks, you're not caught off guard. So, like an example of a way I did this was a couple of years ago, there was a shooting in Burlington where a man allegedly shot 3 Palestinian students. This was around Thanksgiving, I believe it was now 2 years ago. And so, obviously, the first story is like what happened, uh, who was involved. The individual who is the alleged shooter is arraigned, covering the arraignment, covering the city response. There was a lot of just immediate stories. But I knew that given the context of 3 Palestinian students being shot in Vermont, the next question that would be in a lot of people's minds would be, will prosecutors pursue a hate crime or a hate crime enhancement here in Vermont for this shooting? And so knowing that, I knew that a good second or third day story would be what is a hate crime in Vermont? How does that work? And what can we learn from past times this has been charged? And because have I've written about hate crimes before, but I also know that I can get access to the judiciary's records that contain a list of all the times a hate crime enhancement has been added. And I know exactly who to ask for that, and that they can get it to me within a day or so because I've got that good relationship with them. And I've also made that request and know specifically what to ask for so I can get it when I need it. And so actually what happened was the morning of the arraignment for the alleged shooter, before I went to the courthouse, it was probably 7:30 or 8 in the morning, I made that request to get a data of all the hate crime charges that had been filed in the state of Vermont in the last couple of years. And I believe by the end of the day, I had that list. And so I was able to write the daily story and immediately start working on the second day story, which was kind of an analysis of how the law worked in Vermont and also what were the time, how these cases had played out in the past. And so that let me so let's see, this was Monday, Tuesday. So Wednesday, I was able to publish a pretty comprehensive story with this nut graph here. As law enforcement officials continue to investigate the weekend shooting in Burlington that wounded 3 students, they'll be weighing whether to pursue hate crime charges. A recent review of cases in Vermont suggests that it may be difficult for prosecutors to prove a hate crime occurred unless the defendant made incriminating statements during the incident. And that's a pretty strong nut graph. And I was able to get there because I had, essentially been practicing and thinking about when do I need these kinds of records and how can I get them quickly and to tell the story, a comprehensive story like this shortly after a breaking news event. And, this involved going back to the courthouse and using the list I'd gotten from the judiciary to look up all these cases that they'd sent me and read. So there's legwork behind it. It's not just getting the records. And I think that's one thing to really keep in mind is that, the records are just a part of the story. It's not off. I tend to find that the strongest stories, use records as a starting off point. They can really be a backbone for a story, but good sort of shoe leather reporting, using those records to find sources, to go to people, to get human voices in your story is really important. So don't just stop at the records. Use those as a starting point as well. Um, the next piece of advice I would have is to be, I call it being a person, and part of that is showing up. So instead of making a formal records request, maybe just go to the place where the records are kept and ask to see them. It's pretty basic, and I sometimes forget that and have to remind myself. It's very easy to sit here at my computer and send the records requests by email to the records clerks, but I think sometimes um, people get that formal records request and it can be a little intimidating. And sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes that might, jumpstart them into giving you what they want, but also sometimes that can make people a little cagey and they might feel like you're coming at them in a way that you're not. I mean, you're using the law, you can definitely do that, but sometimes people have reactions that are make it a little harder for you to get the record. So showing up in person, I think, can be a really effective way to get what you need. And sometimes the access can be better because they might just hand you the file of records and say, "Here, take a look at it." Like, I don't want to go through this. Why don't you just take a look and get what you need? And that's cheaper because often you can be charged if someone is taking time to go through the records. And another thing is that in Vermont, agencies can't charge for inspection of records. So if you're not making copies of them, if you're just looking at them, taking notes, that's free. And obviously, it's great to not have to pay for the records. You shouldn't have to pay for them regardless, but the Vermont law does allow inspection of records for free, or they're not allowed to charge you. So it's a good thing to show up in person. And an example of this, so this story here, Roaches and Broken Locks, Mark and Rick Bove's Growing Empire of Affordable Rentals Vexes Code Enforcers, was a very document-heavy story that I did a couple of years ago with Derek Brower at 7 Days. And it was one of the reasons why it was so document heavy was we were tracking these landlords' rental properties that spanned multiple towns and municipalities around the county. And we were having to find inspection records and that each of these towns had. There were also state agencies that regulated housing and rental subsidies that we were going to for records. There were court filings, business filings. There was probably thousands of records that we had to go through for this case. And some of those were formal records requests, but some of the best things that we got were when we went to town offices and just showed up there and asked what they had. And in one case, I had sent a records request to one town, I think it was Essex Junction, and I'd gotten like a couple of things, not a lot. And then we kind of followed back up and we ended up going there in person and we got this huge file. I'm not exactly sure where the wires were crossed, but when we went there in person and met with the person in charge of the records, we got this huge file which had tons of email exchanges between town officials and the Boves, where we sort of got this unfolding battle about a dumpster that was at this property that was always overflowing, and Rick Bove was trying to take care of it himself, and the town was pushing him to take it. And it just was this color, and ended up being this whole section of the story about ways in which towns struggled to pull these properties into compliance. It was really illuminating because we had such strong records, and we only got those because we showed up in person. And another thing that we got showing up in person was unredacted documents, which was really helpful in trying to find tenants to talk to for this story. Is we got some actually records that we had gotten from a housing authority, but the housing authority had redacted the names of all the tenants. But when we went to the town, we actually got the unredacted names. So that's also another thing to think about, is what agencies touch the records that you're looking for, and to go to all of them, because some people might redact differently than others. Some agencies might give you the record entirely. Some might redact it. Some might withhold it. Some of this is just the uneven landscape that you can run into. But if you're getting stuck with one agency, think about, are there other agencies that interact with the record that you're looking for, and try to go get it. And in this case, with this story about the Bove's rental empire, we really needed to get as many records as we can. And so going in person was also a good way of doing due diligence to make sure that we got everything we needed. And it ended up being, I think, a really strong story because the records provided such a good starting off point, and because it gave us this really unvarnished look inside of the sort of disputes that were going on between municipalities, regulators, and these landlords, which sometimes people won't get that way on an interview, but if you get their emails, you can see that. And kind of related to being a person and showing up, it's just maintaining that records mindset and thinking about what records do you need. So, um, if you can't show up in person, call and talk to the people that are there. And earlier this year, working with Derek at 7 Days Again, we did a story where we tried to track the number of people who died while homeless in the state of Vermont, which is not something that the state does. So, as the headline says, we did. And this was another very heavy records story that involved getting death certificates and then combing through those to look for identifiers of people who might have been homeless at the time of their death. Very, very labor intensive, going through these Excel spreadsheets and just sort of looking for clues and then making records requests to police agencies based on those clues. So I bring this up to just sort of talk about the deadline aspect. As we were working on this story, we had to finish it. We were getting closer to the deadline, and agencies had been slow getting back to us with police reports that we were using to confirm or get more details on people who might have died while homeless. And we got one record back from Morrisville, and it was a very striking police report about this man who had been found in a shed near a softball field, and he had died. And it was just a very, very sad story. But in that police report, the investigating officer noted that there'd been a note found with the body that described where the man, Michael Mallon, just sort of described the situation he was in. And when I saw that, I thought to myself, well, like, I wonder, well, that must be part of the police investigation. That's a record, that's a public record, so I should get it. But because I was on a deadline, we were getting closer to needing to write and publish. I didn't want to waste time making the formal records request, and so I just called and I just said, "Hey, I read this report. I saw that this note was in there. Is that maybe part of the file?" And it was, and I got it like an hour later, very quickly. And so sometimes just calling and asking is a really useful way. And it ended up leading to a good conversation with the chief, who knew this individual. And just this note, I just wanted to bring it up, as this handwritten note. And so I got this handwritten note that talks about the struggles that this man Michael was going through, and how felt like the system wasn't working. And it was just a powerful narrative moment where we were able to get a record, describe it, and it was a strong piece, and we wouldn't have gotten it, I don't think, as quickly had I not just called and asked for it. So moving on to another way to I've sort of referenced this, is seeking alternative avenues. If you're having trouble getting a record, think about, who do I actually need? I miswrote this, but who do you need to talk to get that record? What other agencies touch them? Who might have access? And is there a court record? Court records can sometimes be a little easier to get, I have found. And in this example here, this was a story I just did recently about a man who was fatally shot just a week after moving to Vermont. He was in the midst of a mental health crisis, and police were called, and he ended up being shot and killed. It's a very, very sad situation, and unfortunately, one I've covered similar cases over the years. What often happens when you're covering police shootings is that you can't get any any access to the police investigation or records related to the investigation, to the body camera footage while the investigation is ongoing here. That's just, you don't usually get anything until after the Attorney General's office and county prosecutor have made a decision about whether or not to bring charges. And as a reporter trying to inform the public about a situation like this, when it happens, that can be hard because you're only relying on often details that are released initially by state police in press releases. And I know there's more out there. I would like to be able to tell a more complete story. And in this case, Scott Garvey's family talked with me and I was able to paint a portrait of who Scott was, which I think is important to do. But I wanted to try to talk more about what happened and why the police responded the way they did. And any additional details about what went down with the shooting was really important. And so I realized that in the press releases that state police had put out, they had said that they'd applied for a search warrant during this incident and a judge had granted it. And when I saw that and I thought, well, they applied for a search warrant and it was granted. So they had to file something with the court in order to get that search warrant. They would have to file an affidavit describing the situation to get the search warrant. And I figured it would be worth asking the court if they had that search warrant, if I could get the documents related to that warrant. And it turned out there were affidavits filed with the court, and I was able to get them, which it helped fill in some details. I was able to get a search warrant that had been filed during the standoff, and then one filed by a trooper that was investigating the shooting. And in that affidavit, there was description of the body camera footage that troopers on the scene had been wearing. And so I was able to tell a more full story about what happened. Obviously, there are still more details to fill in, but because I was able to kind of do a workaround by going to the courts directly and asking for the affidavit for the search warrant, I was able to get more details than I normally have gotten in these situations. So if you start thinking, just because an agency, in this case, a police agency is saying, well, we can't release it, the investigation is ongoing, think, is there anything that could be filed with the court that could shed more light on it? Search warrants are a really, really great way to get more information because police have to file an affidavit in order to get that search warrant. It can be a little tricky to get, but they are gettable. So that's a good one to, I think, keep in mind. And similarly, when you are looking at cases that you follow, look at the docket and click on everything. Do not rush this. Last year, I was writing about a series of recent homicides that happened in Vermont that all seemed to involve somebody that had sort of touched the mental health system. And it's really hard to gain access to like mental health agencies and competency hearings or competency evaluations and these things. But I happened, as I was scanning through the docket for one of the cases, that the attorney, an attorney had filed a full competency evaluation for one of the people in the story I was writing about, which had a ton of information about the situation and sort of what was going on. And, if you don't look at the docket, there's a lot of often things that are just procedural, but there can also be a lot of things hidden in there that, if you were to just make a records request to an agency, that they might say, oh, no, we can't give that to you. But if there's a court record, you might be able to get some of that stuff if an attorney has filed it with the case. That happened also. Sometimes video footage is filed. There was another police shooting incident, a non-lethal shooting, where prosecutors had to file body camera footage to try to support the charges. So I was able to get the video through the court and publish that, which normally it takes a little bit longer to get access to that kind of thing. So, you know, really, I think the court can be your friend, dockets can be your friend, and just spend some time, especially if you cover courts, going through cases that you're keeping an eye on, and just go through all the documents that are filed. Even if it seems like they might not be anything, there could be something there, and it could lead to a great story. So that's what I got. I'm happy to take any questions if there are some.
Thanks, Liam. Great stuff. I do have one question before we wrap up here.
Sure.
Going back to some of the guidance you gave earlier in the presentation, talking about relationships and the importance of having strong relationships, useful sources. So when you can't get these records through the law, you can go to those individuals and get what you need from them. There might be a number of, younger journalists or those earlier in their career that just haven't had an opportunity yet to create those relationships, to develop them. Any guidance for them on how they can begin doing so?
Yeah, I think calling or going and seeing like a clerk when you're not on deadline, and just offering to talk a little bit, just like asking genuine questions about how do I get these records? Like, how do you operate? Just, I think approaching with some genuine curiosity, and like, again, being a person. Like, these are people behind these things, and just asking how things work can be a good way. And I do that. I still do that sometimes. Like, I ask people, like, I don't understand this. Can you help me with this? Like, showing a little humility, and that I don't know everything, I think can go a long way. And I don't know everything. So it's good to own that, and let people tell you what they know.
Great. Thank you. Liam, thanks so much for this lesson and all the work that you do at Vermont Public. And many thanks to everyone who joined us today. We provide these lessons as a public service to you, so please return the favor and encourage your colleagues and friends to join us. We have a lot to learn from each other, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon. On behalf of NEFAC, thank you. Thank you for all you do. Take care, everybody.